Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today is Sunday, January 18th, 2026. And, if you are the kind of person who keeps a close eye on the geopolitical ticker, you might have noticed a very specific, a high-frequency buzzing coming out of New Delhi this week.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a mix of, I don't know, exhaustion, adrenaline, and, dare I say it, history in the making.
It really is. The atmosphere is, well, it's electric.
Yeah.
We are sitting exactly 9 days away from a date that I suspect historians are going to be circling in red ink for a long, long time. January 27, 2026.
And we aren't talking about some minor policy update or a photo op handshake here. We are talking about what is officially known as the Broad-Based Trade and Investment Agreement, or the BTIA.
Which is just a mouthful.
It is. It sounds like a dull medical procedure, so let's stick to what everyone else is calling it. The India-EU Free Trade Agreement.
GFTA. Much cleaner. And frankly, the name doesn't matter as much as the sheer magnitude of what is happening.
Right, and we have to start with the quote that has been circulating all week. Indian Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, he didn't mince words. He called this the mother of all trade deals.
He really did.
Now, usually when a politician uses a phrase like mother of all anything, my skepticism radar goes, ping. It usually means they signed a memo to have a meeting about a future meeting.
Or they agreed to form a committee to look into the possibility of possibly agreeing on something down the line.
Exactly. But looking at this stack of research and sources we have in front of us today, is he actually right this time? Is this the big one?
I think, for once, the hyperbole is justified. I really do. And to understand why, you just have to look at the scale of the players involved here.
It's enormous.
On one side of the table, you have the European Union. That's 27 member nations, one of the wealthiest, most sophisticated markets on the planet. And on the other side, you have India. We're talking 1.4 billion people, the world's most populous nation, and, the fastest growing major economy for a while now.
It's basically two massive gravitational fields colliding. That's the only way I can picture it.
That's a great way to put it. This isn't just about selling a few more cars or shipping some extra containers of textiles. This is about structural change.
Okay, so let's get into that. What does that mean, structural change?
Well, for starters, we are talking about the potential to double exports. Not a 10 or 20% increase. Doubling them.
Double.
We're talking about reshaping global supply chains that have been, frankly, pretty static for decades. And perhaps most significantly, this represents a massive strategic pivot.
A pivot from what to what?
It's a move away from the traditional dependencies we've all gotten used to. A move away from China, for obvious reasons we can get into. And interestingly enough, a shift away from a heavy reliance on the United States.
That geopolitical angle is fascinating, and we are definitely going to spend a lot of time on that later. So, here is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack nearly 20 years of negotiations, because, let's be honest, this has been a bit of a soap opera.
A long-running one, yeah.
Yeah, to understand how we finally got to the finish line. We need to break down a concept our sources are calling asymmetric liberalization, which sounds complicated, but it's actually the secret sauce that made this deal possible.
It's the absolute core of the agreement. Without it, there's no deal.
We're going to look at the winners, and there are some big ones. So if you make T-shirts in Tirupur, or you enjoy a nice glass of wine in Mumbai, you are going to want to hear this.
Big changes are coming.
We also have to talk about the red lines, the really sensitive stuff that got left on the cutting room floor. I'm looking at agriculture here.
The big one, the third rail.
And finally, we have to contrast this success story with the absolute gridlock, the stalemate we're seeing in India-U.S. trade talks.
It's a tale of two trades. It's a really, really stark contrast when you put them side by side.
So let's jump in. Section 1, the long road to New Delhi. Because this didn't start in 2022, did it? This has been a marathon.
A marathon with a very long nap in the middle. The talks actually began way back in 2007.
2007.
Wow. Yeah. Just to set the scene for now. In 2007, the first iPhone had just been released. The global financial crisis hadn't really hit yet.
A different world.
A completely different world. The geopolitical landscape was, unrecognizable from today. China was viewed largely as an opportunity, this great untapped market, not the strategic competitor it's seen as now.
So the initial mood was optimistic.
Very much so. There was a lot of hope. They started talking. They made some progress. But then reality set in. They negotiated for about 6 years, but by 2013, the whole thing just collapsed. The talks faltered and completely stopped, dead in the water.
Okay, so why? Why did it die back then What were the sticking points in 2013?
It was a mix of things. I'd say hubris and a lack of, well, a lack of urgency. The EU was coming in with some very maximalist demands. They wanted massive immediate tariff cuts on things like cars and wines.
The classic EU asks.
Classic ones. And India, on the other hand, was demanding huge concessions on things like visa liberalization, what they call Mode 4 access, for its IT professionals to work in Europe.
So they were miles apart.
Miles. Neither side was willing to blink. And honestly, back in 2013, the global system kind of seemed to be working, you know? The supply chains were humming along. There was no burning platform they felt they could afford to walk away.
And so they did. For nearly a decade.
That's right. Just silence. Until June 2022. That is the key date for the revival, the moment everything changed.
So what happened? Why did they suddenly decide to pick up the phone again in 2022 after almost 10 years of nothing?
In a word, the world broke. Or at least the old operating manual for the world broke.
Okay, how so?
You had a cascade of crises. First, the pandemic, which exposed just how fragile and, frankly, how dangerous global supply chains were when you relied on a single source for everything from microchips to medicine.
Right. The just-in-time model suddenly looked like a just-in-trouble model.
Exactly. Then you had the war in Ukraine, which was a massive wake-up call for Europe. It forced them to confront the dangers of energy and resource dependency on an unreliable partner.
And looming over everything.
And looming over everything was the rising tension with China. The EU's official stance shifted from China as a partner to China as a, quote, systemic rival. That changes everything.
So the entire calculation shifted. It went from, it would be nice to have a deal with India, to, we fundamentally need this deal for our economic survival and security.
That's it, exactly. It became a geopolitical necessity. Europe desperately needed to de-risk and diversify its supply chains. It needed a reliable, democratic, large-scale partner in Asia that wasn't China.
And India was the obvious answer.
The only answer at that scale. And for India, the motivation changed too. They needed to supercharge their manufacturing sector, create jobs for a massive young population, and attract high-tech investment to move up the value chain. The stars finally aligned.
And that urgency is what has driven this final sprint we are seeing right now.
Precisely. Our sources are confirming that as of today, January 18, 2026, 20 out of the 24 chapters of the agreement are finalized. They are locked in.
20 out of 24. That is incredibly close. I'm reading here that they are holding daily virtual sessions right now, like literal round-the-clock Zoom calls between Brussels and New Delhi to close the gap on the final 4 chapters.
It's a full-court press. They are hammering out the details on some very tricky subjects, but they have a hard deadline.
Summit, January 27th.
The summit. And you have to look at the guest list. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa are both flying into New Delhi.
That's heavy hitters only. You don't send the Commission President and the Council President just to say, hey, we're still working on it.
Absolutely not. You send them to sign the document. This visit, it's a signal. It says this is a done deal. This is a strategic alignment in what the sources are calling a complex global economy. They are ready to plant a flag.
But this isn't just a standard trade deal, is it? We mentioned this earlier. The structure itself is unique. Our outline calls it asymmetric liberalization. Can we unpack that? Because usually when I think of a free trade agreement, I think of pure reciprocity.
You're right. That's the textbook definition.
I lower my wall, you lower your wall, and we do it at the same time, at the same height.
That is the standard FTA model, yes. Equal and immediate tariff cuts. But the problem is, if you apply that rigid logic to 2 economies that are in completely different weight classes, well, the smaller or less developed one gets crushed.
Right. I can see that. If you open the floodgates immediately, the mature, highly capitalized European industries could just wipe out India's domestic manufacturers before they even have a chance to compete.
Exactly. It would be a political and economic disaster for India, and that's why the 2013 talks failed. So this time, the negotiators adopted this philosophy of asymmetric liberalization. It's a deal that is balanced, but it is not identical.
Balanced but not identical. What does that mean in practice?
It means it acknowledges reality. It acknowledges that India is a developing nation with certain vulnerabilities, and the EU is a highly developed bloc, so it's tailored.
So how does that work? Does India get a head start or something?
In a way, yes. Our sources say India gets earlier access for its key exports to the EU. So Indian goods, think textiles, leather, certain engineering products, can enter Europe with reduced or zero duties much faster.
Okay, so that's the earlier access for India. What's the other side of the coin?
On the flip side, The EU gains market access to India, which is what it wants, but it happens gradually. It's a phased approach.
Phased over how long?
The timeline for India to eliminate tariffs on European goods ranges from 3 years on some items to 7 to 10 years, or even longer, 15 years in some super sensitive cases, depending on the sector.
That makes a lot of sense. It gives Indian industries a crucial buffer period. They have a decade, maybe more, to upgrade their technology, improve their efficiency, scale up, and get ready for the full force of European competition. It's not an abrupt disruption.
Exactly. It's described in our materials as ambitious but prudent. And that prudence is the key to the political acceptability of the deal in India. You simply cannot sell a deal that destroys your own factories on day one. This structure allows them to adapt.
Okay, so that's the prudent part. Let's look at the ambitious part now. What does India win right out of the gate? Because the export projections I'm seeing here are, frankly, staggering.
They are massive, and it's not just one source saying this. The industry consensus groups like the Federation of Indian Export Organizations, or FIEO, and the Apparel Export Promotion Council, they all predict that Indian exports to the EU will double.
Double.
We are talking about a jump from around $75 or $76 billion in the 2024-25 fiscal year to over $150 billion by 2029 or 2030.
Doubling exports to your largest trading partner in 4 or 5 years is wild. That's an economic earthquake.
Yeah.
Which sectors are driving that?
The sources call them the game-changer sectors, and the biggest one by far is labor-intensive manufacturing. This is the stuff that creates millions of jobs. Specifically, we're talking textiles and apparel.
This is one of the most interesting parts of the research for me because it highlights a specific, almost unfair disadvantage India's been dealing with for a long time.
It's the tariff wall. It's been a huge problem. Right now, if you are an Indian textile manufacturer in, say, Tirupur, and you're trying to sell a container of T-shirts to a retailer in Germany, you are immediately hit with tariffs of around 12 to 16%.
Which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize the margins in the clothing industry are razor thin. A few percentage points is the difference between profit and loss.
It is. But the real kicker isn't just the tariff itself, it's the competition. Countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam have had duty-free access to the EU for years.
Why is that?
Well, Bangladesh gets it because of its least developed country status, which gives it preferential access. And Vietnam went out and signed its own FTA with the EU a few years back.
So an Indian shirt is automatically 16% more expensive than a Bangladeshi shirt before you even factor in the cost of cotton or labor or anything else.
Precisely. India has been fighting with one hand tied behind its back. This FTA eliminates that tariff. It goes to 0% over a phased period. That levels the playing field instantly.
And the impact of that is?
The Apparel Export Promotion Council projects a doubling of textile and apparel exports to the EU within 3 years of implementation.
Wow.
And remember, this is a massive employment generator. This isn't just about corporate profits in Mumbai. We are talking about millions of jobs, many held by women, on factory floors across the country. It's a livelihood issue on a massive scale.
And it's not just clothes, right? I see leather goods are in the same boat.
Yes, very similar story. Footwear, handbags, leather accessories. Current tariffs are up to 16%. Those are being eliminated. This is critical for industrial hubs like Agra and Kanpur that rely so heavily on the leather trade.
But India isn't just selling shirts and shoes anymore. The economy has changed. We have to talk about high-value manufacturing. Let's start with pharmaceuticals.
This is a huge win. India is often called the pharmacy of the world for a reason. It has a massive world-class generic drug industry, but getting those drugs into the highly regulated European market has been tough.
It's not just about tariffs there, is it? It's the red tape.
It's the red tape, the non-tariff barriers. So the deal includes significant tariff reductions, down to 0% on many lines, but more importantly, it includes provisions for regulatory streamlining.
What does that mean in simple terms?
It means creating a smoother, faster pathway for Indian generics and specialty medicines to get approved for sale in the EU. It reduces the paperwork, the duplicate testing, the bureaucratic hurdles. It removes the friction.
That is huge. That could save companies millions and get affordable medicine to patients faster.
It could. And we see similar gains in engineering goods and electrical machinery. Reduced duties mean Indian-made engines, pumps, industrial components. They all become more price competitive against global rivals from China or elsewhere.
Even gems and jewelry are on the list.
Yes, a massive export sector for India, especially out of Surat and Mumbai. They're getting tariff concessions and that same kind of regulatory streamlining we see in pharma.
So it's a broad-based boom for Indian exports. But trade is a two-way street. The EU didn't spend 20 years negotiating this just to be nice. They want something big in return. Section 4 of our outline calls it accessing the elephant.
The elephant being the massive and massively protected Indian consumer market. It has historically been a fortress with very high protectionist barriers. The EU wants to break into that fortress.
And it looks like they got some big wins. Let's start with the one that always makes headlines in these trade deals. Alcohol, wines, and spirits.
It's always the first thing people ask about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Will my scotch be cheaper?
Well, will it? Because right now the tariffs are insane. What is it, up to 150%?
It is. It's one of the highest in the world. It effectively prices imported alcohol out of the market for anyone but the absolute ultra-wealthy.
So what's the deal?
Okay, so here's the deal. The tariffs are being cut significantly, but, and this goes right back to that prudent asymmetric strategy, the cuts are targeted very specifically at the premium segment.
How does that work? How do you target a cut?
The deal specifies the tariff cuts apply to bottles priced above a certain threshold. The reporting suggests it's around $4 or $5 per bottle import price, the cost, insurance, and freight price.
So cheaper stuff isn't getting the cut.
Not as much. For the premium stuff, the tariff drops immediately to about 75%, and then there are further reductions phased in over the next several years.
So the logic is to protect the domestic Indian industry, the lower-cost wines and spirits made in India, in places like Nashik, while opening up the luxury tier.
That's exactly it. It mirrors the strategy that was being discussed in the India-UK FTA talks as well. You protect the mass market producers who operate at lower price points, but you allow the European luxury brands, French champagne, Scotch whiskey, German Rieslings, to access the rising Indian middle and upper class that has a taste for these premium goods.
It's a very clever compromise. You give the EU a win, they can sell back home without wiping out your own local industry.
It's a textbook example of the prudent part of the strategy.
Okay, but let's talk about the big one. The one that usually kills these deals dead in their tracks. Automobiles.
The touchiest of subjects. This is where trade negotiations go to die.
Indian tariffs on imported cars are legendary. They're anywhere from 60 to 100%, sometimes more with all the taxes. It's all designed to force foreign companies to build factories in India under the Make in India policy. The EU has been pushing against this wall for 20 years.
They have, with very little success until now.
So did the wall finally come down?
I'd say it developed a door, but it's a very slow-opening, heavily guarded door. The compromise here is a long game. We are looking at phased reductions over 10 to 15 years.
A 15-year phase-out. That is a very long time in the auto industry.
It is. It gives the Indian domestic auto industry and the foreign players who have already invested in manufacturing in India a very long runway to adapt. There are some reports of quotas for immediate tariff cuts, but only in very select categories, perhaps for electric vehicles or luxury models.
But what's really fascinating here is the technical side, specifically something our notes call the strict rules of origin. I saw this and it seems really important. This is about preventing a backdoor into the Indian market, right?
Precisely. This is one of the most crucial and, frankly, most overlooked parts of the deal. The great fear for Indian negotiators is what's known as Chinese transshipment.
Can you explain that for us? What does that mean?
Okay, so China has a massive car industry now, and it's producing a lot of EVs. The worry for India is that a Chinese company, which faces its own high tariffs and security restrictions in India, could try to exploit this new EU deal.
How would they do that?
Well, they could ship a nearly finished car or all the major components of a car to a factory in, say, Hungary or another part of Europe. There, they do a little bit of final assembly, maybe put the wheels on, slap a Made in Europe sticker on it, and then try to ship it to India duty-free or with low duties under this new FTA.
Bypassing India's direct tariffs and security measures against Chinese goods.
Exactly. It would undermine the entire point of the deal. To stop that, the agreement has very strict rules of origin. It requires 40 to 50% local content.
What does that mean, local content?
It means for a German car To qualify for the lower tariffs when coming into India, a significant chunk of that car's value, 40 to 50%, has to have been created in either the EU or India. You can't just import all the valuable parts from China, assemble them in Europe, and call it a European car.
This is a very specific geopolitical safeguard built right into the trade math. It's not just about economics.
It absolutely is. It's about ensuring the benefits of the deal actually go to European and Indian industry, not to a third party that's trying to game the system.
Oh.
And beyond cars, of course, the EU gets easier market access for other key exports like high-end machinery and aircraft, which makes sense. India's airlines are on a buying spree, and its factories need European capital goods to power their own industrial growth.
Okay, so we have the winners. India gets a boom in labor-intensive goods and pharma. Europe gets a slow opening but significant door into the Indian market for cars, wine, and machinery. But we have to talk about what got left out, the red lines, because you can't have a trade deal of this magnitude without someone or some sector being unhappy.
And this is where the deal is as notable for what's not in it as for what is.
Let's start with the holy cows, as they are often called in India. Agriculture. Is it fully excluded?
Fully, 100%. Agriculture and dairy are completely off the table for this FTA. There is no ambiguity about that in our sources.
Why is that such a hard line for India? I mean, every country protects its farmers, but this seems absolute.
It's because of the human scale of it. In Europe, agriculture is largely a corporate, highly mechanized, and heavily subsidized industry. In India, it still involves hundreds of millions of smallholder farmers, many living on the edge of poverty.
So opening that sector to a flood of subsidized European agricultural products.
It would be socially and politically catastrophic. It would decimate rural livelihoods on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. No Indian government could survive that. It's a non-starter.
So the Indian government simply said, no access, full stop.
That was the red line. And frankly, the EU is also extremely protective of its own farmers. Just look at the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP. So strangely enough, both sides were probably quite relieved to just agree to disagree and carve the whole thing out.
So no French cheese or apples flooding the market.
Well, there are some limited openings for certain agro-processed items. Think cookies, certain high-end cheeses, chocolates, things like that. But the core sectors, wheat, milk, rice, raw produce, poultry, they are completely ring-fenced and protected.
And there was also some defensive handling on meat and poultry as well, right?
Yes, very limited openings, if any. Basically, anything that threatened food security or the core of the rural economy in India was a no-go zone from day one.
Now, here is where the story takes a bit of a twist. Because it's not as simple as just cutting tariffs anymore. We have the successful deal, tariffs are coming down, champagne is popping, but there is an invisible friction lurking in the background, an acronym I'm seeing everywhere. CBAM.
The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is the plot twist in the third act. While tariffs are going down because of the FTA, the EU is introducing this mechanism effective this very year, 2026.
Okay, can you explain CBAM simply? Because it sounds like a nightmare of an acronym.
The simplest way to think of it is as a carbon tax at the border.
A carbon tax.
Yes. The EU has very strict and very expensive environmental laws for its own companies. They have to pay for their carbon emissions. The EU doesn't want its companies to be undercut by competitors in countries with looser environmental rules. That problem is called carbon leakage.
Carbon leakage. Meaning, European companies might just move their factories to countries with no carbon tax to save money.
Exactly. Or foreign companies can just produce goods with high emissions and sell them cheaply in Europe, putting cleaner European companies out of business. So to prevent that, the EU is going to charge a tax on certain imports.
And the tax is based on what?
It's based on the carbon emissions generated during the production of that imported good. The main targets for now are steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizer, and hydrogen. Very carbon-intensive industries.
So let me get this straight. India negotiates a fantastic deal to cut the tariff on its steel exports to 0% under the FTA.
Right, a big win.
But then the EU turns around and slaps a new CBAM tax on that same steel because Indian steel manufacturing is generally more carbon-intensive than European steel manufacturing.
You've got it. That's the friction. It acts as a non-tariff barrier. The tariff might be zero, but the final price in Europe is still higher because of this carbon cost.
The source notes explicitly that Indian steel and petroleum exports might get tariff relief from the FTA, but then get hit by CBAM costs. So are the gains from the FTA just canceled out?
Not entirely canceled out. Our sources are clear on this. They say the gains are partially offset, The net result is still a positive for India, but it definitely complicates the picture and reduces the overall benefit in those specific sectors.
It feels a little bit like the EU is giving with one hand and taking with the other.
That's certainly how it's perceived in some quarters in New Delhi. But from the EU's perspective, it's about maintaining a level playing field and achieving their climate goals. But you're right, it does create an incentive.
What kind of incentive?
If Indian companies want to fully enjoy the benefits of this FTA in the long run, they have to green their supply chains. They have to invest in cleaner steel production, greener aluminum. It forces adaptation. The trade deal becomes a catalyst for green transition.
It's really interesting how climate policy is now completely inextricable from trade policy. You can't just ship goods anymore. You have to ship clean goods. The carbon content of your product is now part of its price.
It's the new reality of global trade. And this brings us perfectly to the broader context. We can't talk about this deal in a vacuum. We have to look at the geopolitical chessboard. Section 7 of our outline calls this the tale of three trades.
This is the part that I think is most relevant to the global listener because it's about more than just India and the EU. We have the India-EU success story we just described, 20 chapters done, signing is imminent, everyone's happy. But then you look at the India-US relationship.
And it is night and day, a completely different story.
The sources describe the India-US trade talks as stalled and volatile. In fact, they collapsed temporarily in 2025 due to, quote, communication breakdowns. Why is it so different? Why can Brussels get a deal done, but Washington can't?
It comes down to a fundamental difference in approach and, well, demands. The U.S., in its trade negotiations with India, has been adamant about demanding market access for its agriculture and dairy products.
This exact red line we just discussed.
The very red line that Europe respected and very deliberately stepped around. The U.S. kept pushing on it, and the door slammed shut. The U.S. approach has been described as very transactional, very all or nothing. Open your farms or there's no deal.
And on top of that, you have the existing U.S. tariffs on Indian goods, which are quite high.
They are. High tariffs on certain goods, up to 50% in some cases. And don't forget the punitive measures that were linked to India's Russian oil purchases. That extra 25% tariff that hit a range of Indian goods.
That kind of thing creates a lot of bad blood, I'd imagine. It's not a great foundation for a friendly negotiation.
It's not. The source material describes dealing with the U.S. as dealing with a protectionist partner, where trade is often weaponized for security and geopolitical aims. In stark contrast, the India-EU deal is consistently framed by both sides as a strategic partnership. It's about building mutual resilience, not about one side bullying the other into submission.
And where does the U.S.-EU relationship fit into this triangle? They're allies, but do they have an FTA?
No, and that's a crucial point. The big U.S.-EU trade deal, the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that was abandoned years ago. It completely fell apart.
So what do they have?
They rely on something called the Trade and Technology Council, or TTC, for coordination. But that's just a forum for talking. It's not a binding trade treaty. And even there, we see constant tension. The U.S. has been threatening tariffs on the EU, too, most recently in a dispute regarding Greenland.
So, if you zoom out, the big shift here is undeniable. The global trade map is being redrawn. India is actively diversifying away from its traditional heavy reliance on the U.S. market, and of course away from China on the supply side.
And at the same time, the EU is diversifying away from China and finding the U.S. to be an increasingly unreliable and protectionist partner. So what happens? India and Europe found each other in the middle. The India-EU deal is a counterweight in an era of growing protectionism.
So while the U.S. is in some ways building walls, India and Europe are building a bridge.
That's a perfect way to describe it, and it's a very distinct signal to Washington. The signal says, we have other options. We can build a modern, 21st century trade relationship without you, if necessary.
Exactly. And before we get to our final verdict, we should mention that this deal isn't just about physical stuff being put on ships. It's beyond goods. Section 8 in our outline covers services and investment.
Right, and this is an area where the potential is just as massive. The services trade between the two is already huge, about 60 billion euros, or around 65 billion US dollars.
How does the FTA change that?
It expands market access for key Indian service sectors like IT, business consulting, and financial services. But the really big win here, according to our sources, is on digital trade.
What does that mean, digital trade rules?
Yes. For years, there has been a lot of friction over data. The EU has its GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the global gold standard for privacy. India has its own evolving data protection laws, and there have been clashes over things like data localization, whether data has to be stored physically inside India.
Yeah. The kind of issue that can grind business to a halt.
It can. This agreement establishes a common set of digital trade rules and data protection standards that are compatible. It allows data and therefore business to flow much more smoothly between the EU and India. It moves past that historical friction.
And what about on the investment side of things?
There's actually a separate parallel track for that. It's called the Investment Protection Agreement, or IPA. It's moving a bit slower than the main FTA, but the goal is very clear: to promote and protect European investment into India.
Investment in what specifically?
The big focus is on renewable energy, green infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing.
Which connects right back to the CBAM issue we were talking about.
It does. It's all connected. If India needs to green its industry to avoid the EU's carbon tax, it needs massive amounts of capital and technology. This investment protection agreement is designed to make it safer and more attractive for European companies to provide that capital and green tech.
So it's a virtuous cycle, if they can get it right. Europe provides the capital and the technology. India provides the market, the scale, and the manufacturing base to build out that green infrastructure.
That's the vision, a green strategic partnership.
Okay, so let's bring this all home. Section 9, the final verdict. We started this deep dive with the question, is this really the mother of all trade deals? Is the hype from Minister Goyal justified?
After going through all of this, I think the consensus from our sources is a pretty resounding yes. And it's yes for two main reasons.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is the sheer economic scale. We keep coming back to it. But doubling your exports to your largest trading partner in a few years is a massive, tangible boost for the Indian economy. It's a GDP multiplier. It's millions of jobs. It's real.
And the second reason, it's more than just the money.
It's more than the money. The second reason is the precedent it sets. It creates a new blueprint, a new model for how a large developing nation can negotiate with a developed bloc on terms that are, as we said, equal but asymmetric.
A blueprint for the rest of the global south.
Exactly. It proves you don't have to choose between total protectionism and a deal that forces you to open up everything overnight. It shows you can negotiate a deal that respects your development needs, like those 10 and 15-year phase-out timelines, while still integrating with the global economy.
So what does the immediate future look like? What should we be watching for?
All eyes are on January 27, 2026. We watch for the handshake between von der Leyen, Costa, and Prime Minister Modi in Delhi. We wait for the final text to be released.
And then what? It doesn't just come into effect the next day.
No. After that, we have the ratification process. It will take time. It has to get through the European Parliament and all the member states and the Indian legislative procedures. Implementation will likely be in late 2026 or early 2027. But the hard part, the negotiation, is done.
And those parallel negotiations will continue on the side deals, the Investment Protection Agreement, and another one on geographical indications, or GIs.
Right. Things like protecting the name Darjeeling tea or Scotch whiskey. That's an ongoing process. But the main event, the FTA, is crossing the finish line. It's not the end of the road for the relationship, but it's the end of the 2 decades of uncertainty.
It is incredible to think about the journey. 2007, the talks begin with so much optimism. 2013, a complete stalemate. 2022, a dramatic revival driven by crisis. And now, 2026, a landmark signing. It really just goes to show that in geopolitics, timing is everything.
Absolutely. The world had to change for this deal to finally fit the moment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we are left with a pretty provocative thought, aren't we? We have seen the success of this asymmetric, patient, development-focused European model of trade negotiation. And at the same time, we're seeing the stagnation of the American transactional demanding protectionist model.
That is the big question for the next decade of global trade. If this India-EU deal really works, if it delivers that shared prosperity and strategic alignment that it promises, does it effectively render the old American model obsolete?
Will the U.S. wake up in 5 or 10 years and realize that while it was focused on building walls and picking fights, key partners in the global south have aligned with Europe, creating a powerful new economic axis? Will Washington find itself left behind, isolated in its own fortress?
It's a fascinating and for some probably a very worrying possibility to consider, and it's a question that should probably keep some folks in the U.S. Trade Representative's office up at night.
We will be watching the headlines from New Delhi on the 27th very closely, and we hope you will be too. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
See you next time.